All right, hi guys. We're very lucky today to have Ben and Hugo join us from Just Cryptoeconomics. The reason I wanted to have this conversation is because recently they've been releasing a whole bunch of research on token functionality, and they've created a whole cryptoeconomics framework, which I think is probably the most lucid first principles look at what are crypto assets I have ever come across. I've got a long history with Hugo, and it's amazing to see where you've sort of come from and the fact that you've been talking about stuff like this pretty much since we met. So it's awesome to see it published in more sort of formal research. And I'm really excited to explore this framework with you guys today. Maybe we can kick off with a brief introduction, both of you, if you can just give us a little bit of your background and why you're so interested in crypto economics.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today, Jason. Very excited to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about this work that's been in development for a very long time. So my background is in systems engineering. I met Ben back in the day at a company called Smith & Crown, where we essentially worked on different ideas and research and trying to understand, like, how do you design tokens? Essentially, our background is in cryptoeconomic design, working with projects, thinking through token decisions, how they should approach building a product as well as an economy on top of that product, which is a very complex endeavor because building a startup just from a product perspective is quite difficult. So we've spent a lot of time thinking through this, and myself right now, I work for a company called Lemma. I lead research there. Lemma is a Cayman-based service provider that works with a lot of the large foundations in the space. And what I do there is essentially solve very niche go-to-market strategies for projects as they launch their tokens and help them think through those difficult problems.
So like Hugo said, we used to work together at an American company called Smith & Crown. They did cryptoeconomics research and consultancy, so in-house research, and then they worked with companies and open source projects to develop their cryptoeconomics. So that's including the token itself, but it's kind of broader on-chain and off-chain economic and business design. So we were there for several years, and then subsequent to leaving Smith & Crown, Hugo, myself, and our other co-founder, Justin, created Just Cryptoeconomics. And so that's an open access research group. And now we're moving into the sort of analytics space. And so we've recently launched a sort of alpha product called Token Fundamentals that takes our in-house token functionality framework methodology and applies that to tokens in the wild. So we released that, or a very early version of that, just the other week. And so, yeah, that's kind of the context there. My day job is cryptoeconomic design, and I have my own agency called Token Architecture. That's currently what pays the bills. So, yeah, with Hugo and Justin, we're on the research analytics side, and then the rest of my time is spent designing new token economies and cryptoeconomic systems.
Fantastic. Awesome, guys. So we've obviously seen like quite an evolution in how people think about crypto assets. How did you guys, what motivated you guys to actually, start up Just Cryptoeconomics and actually get a framework out there? What did you think was lacking in the industry? What pushed you to do this?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of factors. One of them was definitely in struggling a lot with clients in helping them set a foundation before we start with the design. It's just building a foundation for them to really think through all of the decisions that they make, because token decisions tend to have quite a long-term knock-on effect. And we've seen so many projects in this space fail because they've made bad decisions. But the other end of not building the token is investing into tokens. And we've seen quite a bit through our relationships with different analysts and consulting with funds that there definitely is an uncertainty in the space about how to think about value in tokens. And I'll very much boil it down to a very specific thing. It's because in the traditional world, valuations are hard. I think something like DCF is very important and valuable, but I think any analyst worth his salt understands that it is a tool and it's not a means to the end. Tokens are more complex because there's no standard in terms of what a token looks like. Every project has a different token. It's the beauty of this technology is it allows you to design whatever you want. You can insert any logic. The token can do whatever you want it to do. And that flexibility also introduces complexity when it comes to analysis. So what we see in the space quite a bit is that there's a lot of valuation models that people put forth as like, this is how you do it. We kind of take the attitude that, well, let's take a step back and start thinking about what the token does in relationship with the product that it's supporting, and then kind of work from there to develop the models. And so right now, we're very much at this foundational point of just offering an insight in terms of what other projects have done, give you a view of what the tokens offer as a functionality, meaning like what rights and utilities does the token give the holder, and kind of like understand that relationship. And through that, you can kind of see why is this token valuable relative to the product. And in many cases, and in most designs, it tends to be far lower than what the product's inherent value is. And we kind of just wanted to offer that base for investor analysis to kind of like take a more mature look. We're definitely taking the attitude that analysts have a harder job ahead of them in terms of what's necessary to actually do something that is valuable to the fund.
Interesting. Yeah, there seems to be this incessant need among crypto analysts to just quickly put this in a familiar bucket that's probably inappropriate. And I guess that's also just a function of the fact that the industry is so nascent. When it comes to thinking about token value, there's been like a couple of questions that I always come back to. When I think about something like Ethereum, I think of it very similar to the Internet of Information. And I think it would be ridiculous to, for example, say that the internet is a failure because it doesn't have a profit on the bottom line. Other, sort of questions that arise for me around something like the internet is like, would this thing have been more successful if it was built to be extractive like a common enterprise? And, my logical answer to that is surely not. If there was a toll for every click on the internet, I doubt that it would have reached the penetration that it's reached today, or perhaps it would have, and it would have just been a lot more extractive, and maybe this conversation would be different. Another thing that's always perplexed me is some of these assets that, trade so untethered from their industrial use or their cash flow based intrinsic value. We've got 5,000 years of evidence around gold doing this. We've in the recent sort of money printing era, we've also seen these effects manifest in things like high-end real estate or in fancy wines or collectible art. So, there's definitely precedent for a variety of different assets that can trade completely untethered from perceived cash flow. And then the last and big final question that I always try and ask myself is like, is Ethereum or enter any smart contract platform native token, is it money or is it more similar to a technology platform like Apple and Google? So if we go back to your framework, the thing that was of most interest to me was actually the opening piece around endogenous and exogenous functionality. And Hugo, you pointed out that like the thing that makes these assets so interesting is that we can program into them anything that we want. But you also highlight this exogenous piece. So can you explore that a little bit for us, guys? Why did you differentiate between those two? And why do you think it's important for analysts to bear both in mind?
Ben, do you want to talk about one?
Yeah, sure. So credit to Hugo because he actually drove a lot of this thinking. So a lot of these ideas originally came from Hugo, and we kind of, as a group, developed them further. Really, the idea is like an endogenous functionality is something that, as a designer, you can deliberately and consciously design into your cryptoeconomic system because of the nature of these systems being programmatic, as you mentioned, Jason. And so I think the endogenous functionalities are relatively intuitive and easy to wrap your head around. The exogenous ones are maybe less obvious. And the kind of the TLDR is that these are functionalities that just develop organically and outside of your direct control as a designer. And they typically tend to correspond to kind of more base layer systems that are likely to benefit from more like open network effects. So think of like an Ethereum and its native token Ether. It's more likely to have significant exogenous functionality because there's all these different projects building on top of it. And so Ether can kind of be that common denominator amongst those projects, whether it's like using ETH as collateral in like DeFi systems or otherwise. And so, yeah, these exogenous functionalities, they develop organically outside of the system. They're basically adopted by other actors and by other systems because there's already some kind of network effect in place and significant value accruing from the existing endogenous functionalities. And so, like, related to that is the kind of context that you're never going to have exogenous functionalities emerge unless there's already compelling endogenous functionalities that are in place and being adopted.
Interesting.
For me, just to add on top of that, a very easy one to explain it is that one of the functionalities that we have is payments functionality, meaning this token is used to pay for things. Now, in the endogenous core design, in the case of like something like Bitcoin, if I make a transaction, I pay the miners in BTC. And that is something that if someone were to redesign Bitcoin, that's something they can design for. This is what it costs, this is how it's calculated, all of that. But using Bitcoin as an exogenous payments functionality is using it in the real world. That's something that you cannot account for as a designer. But from a being valuable because it offers this payments functionality is a different way you should look at the same functionality versus the endogenous system and then all exogenous systems that kind of like latch onto that specific token.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of fascinating because all the endogenous stuff can be replicated, right? All the endogenous stuff is forkable. The kind of weird and interesting piece is this emergent phenomenon of these exogenous things. It's the same reasons why, gold had certain characteristics and like it produced some kind of external behavior that assigned those characteristics with something that might be fantastic at storing value over time, or a great way to store value instead of in the melting pot that is fiat is in high-end London real estate. These were not things that we designed for. The bricks in the house cannot account for what this is. Would you say there's an element of what people call monetary premium in these exogenous functionalities? Is that like you're sort of talking about the base layer of it. We summarize it all as monetary premium. Would you say there's some kind of relationship between those two things?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very like the store of value component is one that I think a lot of people hammer on when it comes to tokens because it's this the sky's the ceiling kind of opportunity. It's this value that is derived from social constructs. Very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to come up with a valuation model for something like gold. But we kind of can take the attitude that one of our core functionalities is what we call collateral. Now, this is a way of kind of like saying what kind of like financial leverage does that asset offer the person. And some of it's very social in nature, and meaning that it's because the markets enable it and people believe it's going to be valuable, and thus I accept it as collateral, and I can kind of like determine what the agreement looks like, whether it's really perceived as a store of value. But you can also have something like that, which is far more mechanical in nature. Something like if I were to participate in the Ethereum network and I stake my Ethereum to participate, there's a component that this token is valuable because it allows me to work for the network. It's like a taxi medallion in New York. You need to own it to do work and earn. But the other part of it, it's used as collateral. If I misbehave and I do something that the network doesn't like, it's slashable. They can take the token away from me. And that collateral that I put down is essentially provides the network economic security. So how we think about something like store of value, it is purely the nature that someone believes it's valuable or some system accepts it's valuable. And that kind of like creates this premium. Now, very difficult to measure. And we have a lot of ideas around how to do that. But definitely it forms part of the picture when it comes to tokens, because tokens are generally quite usable in many different environments. Something like an Apple stock, it's usable as collateral to gain leverage and the likes, but in crypto, it's far, far, far broader in terms of what you can use it for. So that kind of like creates a world where in some cases in some exogenous systems, you have very clear usage of the asset as collateral, and it like creates this idea that this thing is valuable. But some of it's far more fluid in the nature of people just hold it because they socially believe it's valuable. But that's definitely one of the harder ones to kind of like come up with a valuation.
I would just add a couple points as well, Jason, to your point around where exogenous functionality can come from and it being related to the monetary premium. I think it's a fair observation, but I think it's even more of a general effect that's going on, and it's really downstream from network effects and the Lindy effect, and then also the kind of rules and governance that exist around the system. So if ETH is being adopted as an exogenous token or asset in other systems, the governance of Ethereum, the system, is incredibly important to the viability of that continuing, the adoption of ETH by other systems. Because if ETH, like if the rules around ETH, whether it's functionality, supply, rewards logic, or otherwise, if those can kind of be arbitrarily changed overnight and abused, then other systems cannot rely on ETH in their own system. And so the governance of the endogenous system is incredibly important to the adoption of that token by exogenous systems. In the same way that if the US government begin to just radically abuse its policy and governance of the dollar system, then other countries are perhaps less likely to issue dollar-denominated debt or take on US dollar-denominated debt or even adopt it as a reserve or alternative currency. So yeah, I think it's related to monetary premium, but it goes even further than that.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thanks, guys. I guess now we should probably have a look at these different token functionalities that you have picked up in your research. I will let you decide how you want to go through them. For the listeners of this call, there will be attached the framework as well as the dashboard that the Just Crypto Economics team has put together, so you can follow alongside this video. So should we start at the top? You have already discussed a couple of functionalities, but maybe we just go through each of them.
Yeah, sounds good. So generally, we have 7 functionalities that kind of like guide our entire thinking and framework. The first one we're talking about, and I lightly touched on it, is what we call service provision, which is this right to participate in a system. Decentralized networks tend to be complex because there's a far more complex supply side when it comes to the service that's provided. This is in contrast to a company that essentially just provides a service through the efforts of the people who work inside of it and the resources that they have, where essentially determining who's able to work is a very important factor in these networks. And in a lot of cases, you might design a token that offers the holder access to work. And to my previous example of the taxi medallions or having a bar license, some networks you don't want 10 million people working for it. You want 1,000. So you design accordingly to give 1,000 people access. And for them to transfer access, there's a value in what they transfer in that access. So typically in these L1 proof of stake networks where the supply side is governed by token holders that kind of lock up tokens in order to do this work, that's a very typical example of where the token has the service provision functionality. Governance is one of the easier and more applied concepts where the token holder has the right to make decisions about this thing it governs. Now, practically in what we see in the crypto space is that governance is pretty light. In most cases where there's governance functionality, the token holders have a say and they govern portions of it. They maybe govern a small treasury that is intended for grants that grow the ecosystem. So it very much depends on the degree of what is governed. I'll just touch on value distribution, and then you can maybe do the rest, Ben. But value distribution is the one that I think the audience would be most familiar with. This is this idea that the token holders have a claim on value that is created by the system. It's equivalent to a dividend. If a token was designed exactly as an equity token, an equity share, which essentially like provides the holders with the right to profit that's created. Value distribution in crypto comes, however, in many different forms. We have buy and burn, which is analogous to stock buyback, but there's quite a couple on that front. So just to recap, service provisioning is the right to provide work for the network. Governance is the right to control the network. Value distribution is the right to the profit of the network in various different mechanisms.
Okay, so three of the first functionalities are associated with rights around the system. Are there any other functionalities that are associated with rights?
Ben, you might be on the touch on membership.
Yeah, so there are others. We have a section in our article that delineate between utilities and rights. It might be a bit of a semantic distinction, but utilities for us is where you as the user have to acquire a token in order to use the system, whether it's a network or a product or otherwise. And then rights are more of like a passive concept where if you hold the token, you have the right to certain benefits or value, whether that's direct dividend or access to certain features. And so like equities would be very much more like a rights type instrument or asset. Whereas like currency might be much more of a utility, for instance. So yeah, we can cover which ones we think are more like rights and which ones are more like utilities if that's of interest. But I'll just run through the remaining four functionalities.
Okay.
So the next one would be membership. So this is more on the demand side. So if you as a user or consumer of a system, you can hold the token and you're going to get certain like benefits as a user or a consumer of that platform. That could be discounts on trading fees. It could be access to early features. It's kind of any sort of demand side consumer-like benefit or feature access that you can think of. So real world analogs would include like credit card programs or airline mile programs. I think there are our colleague who's not here today could speak to this in a lot more detail, but my understanding is there's some companies in Japan, publicly traded companies, that confer kind of membership-like benefits to their shareholders. And so that's like a little bit of a different twist on traditional equity. And so that might also be a relevant traditional comparable and analog. The next one would be payments, which I'm sure everyone like understands very intuitively. This is just where you have to use the token to pay to use a system in any kind of way, whether it's gas fees or real world currency, like with stablecoins. Collateral is the next one. And so there are similarities to the concept of a store of value between collateral and store of value. For us, collateral functionality allows you to do one of two things. Either you can acquire more financial leverage, so you can take out credit or issue debt in a system, or you can cryptographically secure a system. Typically, that's done through a slashing mechanism. So, for instance, if you as a validator in the Ethereum network stake your ETH as a validator, you're actually providing cryptoeconomic security. And if you violate that kind of trust agreement with the protocol set of rules, then the ETH token is confiscated. So you're putting up that collateral to kind of secure your set of rights there. So traditional analogs are probably fairly easy to understand, like government bonds, real estate, and gold can all kind of function as collateral. And then the final functionality is asset ownership. So asset ownership is where you as the holder basically have a claim over some kind of physical or digital asset. So it's relatively straightforward, this one. Traditional analogs would include like property title deeds, royalty rights, gold certificates. And then in Web3 and crypto, we're looking at things like stablecoins, tokenized fiat currency, as well as claims on another like asset pool. So staked ETH, like Lido's staked ETH token, for instance, is a claim on ETH in a pool. And so we would consider that an asset ownership token.
Brilliant. Okay, so our key functionalities, service provision, governance, value redistribution or distribution, membership, payments, collateral, asset ownership. And what you guys are saying is that a token can be designed to do one of or many of these different functionalities.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's very much true. Yeah, the reality is that most tokens have a blend of these different functionalities. The easiest to always like use as an example is something like Ethereum. So Ethereum has this endogenous functionality of payments where you pay to use the network. If you store data on the network, you pay using ETH. You ETH allows you to do work for the network. ETH is used as collateral inside that system. That's all endogenous. In an exogenous world, ETH is used as collateral in different DeFi applications built on top of Ethereum. We kind of consider whether an application is built on top of Ethereum, that is an exogenous system. Even though it's built on Ethereum technically, that
Yes.
is an independent team with an independent design, and they decide how it works. And the adoption of ETH used in Ethereum's DeFi ecosystem is not determined by the core Ethereum design team or the community of Ethereum. It's decided by that specific application, whoever's behind that. Another example from payments, even inside the Ethereum, on top of Ethereum, is in 2017, we saw a lot of tokens being sold on Ethereum. I create a token, I sell it to you, you give me Ethereum to buy it. That is a payments functionality that grew on top of Ethereum in a exogenous system. And another example would be for service provision in an exogenous system. It's so interesting because validators in Ethereum essentially stake this ETH to do the work, but something like restaking essentially says to a validator, well, you have your ETH staked and you do this work for Ethereum. How about you restake it into providing more services? It's essentially like saying that you add more conditions on top of it. And if you don't abide by these additional rules, you might lose your collateral. So that's like the exogenous collateral functionality on top of it. So the landscape around these like L1 systems are very complex because I always try to remind people that in the traditional world, a company is very much a node part of a bigger economy, where in the crypto space, it is all about constantly creating more economies that overlap and interact. And assets have a fluidity and a composability that we've never seen before. And a lot of that composable nature is actually what's driving demand. So, for example, in the case of exogenous payments for ETH, the demand for ICOs in 2017 was definitely the driver which driven that massive price appreciation for ETH, that demand for ETH to invest into other tokens. Nobody at Ethereum side decided that this is what the token should do, but that was the primary driver back then. And in the case of Solana's price appreciation came, in my opinion, came from a demand for meme coins recently. People bought Sol so that they buy meme coins. Now, as that activity is dropping down, the demand for Sol is reducing, and with nothing to do with the core design. Yeah. So I kind of think like that is a very like important mindset to take when it comes to tokens, is that the systems that these tokens touch are very, very broad. And one of the biggest and often misunderstood systems is the real world. I think from a payments perspective or a collateral perspective, Bitcoin being used as money, which never panned out, and as a general form of money, general form of currency, I mean, never panned out. But we're constantly seeing entities, financial entities, different types of organizations willing to accept it as sound collateral. And that is definitely one of the biggest drivers behind Bitcoin. Bitcoin's interesting because the core design is not really what drives the value. Like I pay minus to send Bitcoin to other people to do small things is not the big thing. It's the demand that comes from the real world. This exogenous system is actually what's driving that value.
Yeah, we between our team at Etherbridge, we call it the blockchain onion. There's like if you like take away the layers of what make these systems interesting, right at the heartbeat of them is this cryptographically secured database with, you know, varying consensus mechanisms or varying distribution of nodes. And from our point of view, there's nothing about those first two concentric circles that tells us anything about future price appreciation. it's the layers above. Is it attracting developers? Is it got a healthy DeFi ecosystem? And I think the fact that these tokens have these exogenous functionalities, you know, perhaps seems to be like the big driving force behind token price increasing. I mean, you were talking about like the big thing that makes these things more valuable, historically at least, has been these mass token generation events, whether it was ICOs in 2017 or DeFi summer and all the liquidity mining in 2020 and 21, or the NFT boom. And then, most recently, the meme coin casino of pump.fun, that was, the main beneficiary was obviously going to be the underlying network token that Pump was built on. So fascinating that we've seen that. We haven't been able to articulate it as clearly as you have today, but thank you for adding that. I, I was just thinking about the tokenization theme and the real world asset theme. Do you think there's an opportunity for people that want to bring real world assets on chain to, assign maybe additional functionalities that aren't present in their analog equivalent? Do you think there's like over a long enough period of time an opportunity for Apple stock to assign a feature, a utility feature or something like that? How do you guys think about that?
I could start off. Love to hear your thoughts as well, Ben. Definitely, definitely. I think to Ben's example of how Japanese companies use equity in a very interesting and innovative way is what we preach when we talk to projects in terms of like how they should think about designing, and more specifically in assets that are tokenized and have this asset ownership functionality. It's this asset that's living on chain, and if this asset represents ownership and something that is in the real world, why do you put something on chain? You put something on chain, and most people would assume it's to move it around quite quickly, change the ownership. That is essentially a functionality that's offered to this tokenized asset, as you're able to potentially buy stuff with it, even though it is abstracted in terms of how the medium of exchange works. It offers a lot of functionalities out there. And from the design space, that's kind of why you want to, when you build a project, you want someone to kind of like think through these things and spend the time researching and like coming up with great ideas that allows you to do an approach that is essentially rich in the long term and create as many sources of demand as possible. And I would like to give a couple of examples, but it tends to like focus people in terms of thinking that is what you can do. But there's a massive amount of space, especially in the not so clear-cut functionalities, the membership benefit, for example. Like, I think in most cases where a token has a membership benefit, that's not the reason why this thing's valued at $1 billion or should be valued at $1 billion at all. It's purely like just that extra, that bonus additional utility that you offer users. And the technology offers a way to verify ownership that's never been possible before, and that you are able to actually like build out these confirmations in a way where it's feasible. Like if you had to confirm everyone's stock ownership in something and then kind of like use that to determine who they are and like what they should do and like have they used it before, are they the actual owner that's using it, that's very complex. Blockchain kind of like makes all of this easy and like offers us a design landscape that's never been able before. And especially with like building on some of these blockchains and these systems, is like everyone's building a tool that you can also use. That open access element makes the work and opportunity just so much clearer in the long run.
Fantastic. Ben, I don't know if you got anything to add on that point.
Yeah, so just to map like traditional, if we stick with equities for now to sort of map that to our framework, we would say that equities have two quote unquote token functionalities. So that would be value distribution and governance. Hopefully, that's fairly intuitive. Value distribution, just insofar as companies issue dividends or do stock buybacks, and then governance equity holders either have direct or delegated governance rights and voting rights of some description. So those already exist in the real world. So there would be no need to kind of replicate or redesign that. Asset ownership doesn't typically generate significant additional value because it's just, in most cases, a one-to-one claim on another asset. There is the opportunity to generate yield on the reserve assets, but fairly de minimis relative to some of these other functionalities. Payments, it's kind of hard to see people adopting Apple stock as a currency. Maybe it happens. I think it's unlikely, especially given the volatility. So I think the two that are maybe the most relevant are a membership, which we kind of touched on a little bit, and I think it'd be cool to see, regulatory and legal permitting some companies beginning to experiment with other kind of economic models that basically allow their existing share instruments to be used by consumers on the demand side. Even in energy markets, there's potentially even scope for the kind of prosumer model where both the role of the producer and the consumer is less distinct. Especially when you're talking about renewables, potentially there's something there to explore where you're both a consumer of the energy and you're also producing and supplying it back to the grid. Service provision is an interesting one. I think it would be tricky to replicate in an entirely kind of centralized governance design and governance model. All the examples of service provision functionality that we see in Web3 are predicated on blockchain, open source kind of crypto rails, where the rules of the system are known and they can't be, in theory at least, changed arbitrarily by a single entity or a concentrated number of people. Like that's the theory. Whether that actually happens in practice is more debatable. So I think like a service provision functionality is like conceptually interesting to traditional systems, but replicating it in the same way is probably not feasible. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
Cool.
Yeah, it's just to add a little bit of color to that, which sounds like a crazy idea, but let's use the example of tokenized Apple stock. Let's say Apple decides, you know what, we're going to expand our product offering. We are going to use the devices that we have around the world, and we are essentially going to create a decentralized AI inference network. We're going to use the devices in the sense that you maybe have to own a tokenized Apple stock, X amount, in order to contribute to this network. And you're essentially owning the stock in the company, but you're also being paid for this work that you do for this new system that they're kind of developing. This kind of like creates just a landscape for, in my mind, like you can have crazy ideas. And I think we're very, very far away from using assets as things that create more value based on the products that we want to build. Very much like we always argue that a good token designer is someone that really understands who they're working with and what this team is trying to build. It really helps you to understand the vision because it helps you to plan for the long run. It's kind of like a big problem that we see in the space is that when most projects go to market, they kind of get this person to help with the token design. And what the person really does is maximize go-to-market. They're going to think about like, how do we raise as much capital as possible? Or how do we design it so that the VCs are happy? How do we design it so that we have a lot of push and attention at launch and the price appreciates? But it's often such a neglect for the long-term product requirements. It's a bit of a tangent, but it's definitely one of the things that we feel very dearly about.
Yeah. I guess like the design space is just so open-ended. But at least now I think with your framework, we've got a really good foundation to build upon. Is there anything, as a result of your framework that you would love to see in the long run around crypto economics?
I think a lot of questions from analysts trying to understand like why we think about it like that. That is, we are very open to engage with anyone that wants to have that conversation right now, because where we are right now is that we have this V1 model that is really just mapping the different functionalities and giving details to this. Like if you hover your mouse over value distribution on the ETH token endogenously, you'll see, well, X amount of the transaction fees burned, and that is a stock buyback of sorts. What we would like to see it evolve into as we get buy-in into this mindset is that we offer dimensions, as I could put it like that, is like trying to offer you the individual tools to think about each of these functionalities, which is, let's say, for example, governance. How much of the system you can govern is a dimension that should probably influence how you approach the valuation. It's right now it's very close to a 0 or 1 kind of output, but giving you more color in the long run is kind of like where we're heading to. But we're taking a lot of feedback. We're talking to a lot of people. And as we plan out this next couple of months in terms of the work that we have to do to get there, that's kind of like what we hope to see, is that there's an interest to approach valuation from a foundational level and then build towards case studies that offer models. Right now, what we see in the industry is a lot of models being pushed in front of people saying, this is the model for tokens. This is how you do it. This is how you tackle L1 tokens. And there's a lot of arguments. And what we constantly think of when we see it is that there's definitely a lack of a holistic approach when approaching these valuation models. So bottom up is kind of like our attitude right now, and that's what we hope for.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think for another session at a later time, it would be fantastic to go through some of these proposed valuation metrics. I know Hugo and I have discussed some of them. But I think that's it for today, guys. It would be really helpful if you could tell us how we could find you, how we could get in contact with you. If there's any analysts that have listened to this and would like to get in contact with you, can you tell us how they would find you?
Yeah, sure. Our website is just cryptoeconomics.com. On the website, you'll find all of the contact information, whether it's through Telegram or on Twitter. We're trying to push the marketing side of things. It's definitely not our strong suit. We are researchers at heart, and we're trying to kind of like put our name out there and create awareness. So very glad for this opportunity. On Twitter, you can find us at Just Crypto Econ, at Just Crypto Econ. I'm pretty sure we'll add it in the show notes, but yeah, if you send us a message anywhere, we'll definitely pick it up right now because the traffic is still pretty low, seeing we've just launched.
Yeah, you can find it on LinkedIn as well. It's one of the newer
I still
platforms.
use LinkedIn.
Yeah, Ben's responsible for the LinkedIn side of things. I'm responsible for the Twitter side of things.
Okay.
Yeah, irresponsible if I didn't plug our LinkedIn activity.
I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, to be the LinkedIn guy, but I'm glad someone's doing it. Guys, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm very excited to see where this goes. And from my personal standpoint, this has been really, really beneficial to our understanding at Etherbridge of what crypto assets are. We recognize that it is a foundation, not an answer, but it's certainly made our ability to analyze these networks and these assets that much easier. So thank you for the work that you've done, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.